in English. Well, I'll try to condense a 16-page paper into a 15-minute presentation. Well, first of all, you can see the presentation is entitled "The Representation of Cuba in the New York Times after December 17, 2014, from now on 17D." Well, here are two photos of both presidents simultaneously announcing to both countries and the world that a new policy between Cuba and the United States was going to be adopted. The reaction was immediate. That caricature was published by the New York Times right after the announcement, and well, it was a big surprise for many people, including that man in the caricature representing many members of the Republican Party in the United States. Well, historically, there are many works, many books and articles about this, published both in Cuba and the United States. Historically, the representation of Cuba in the US mainstream media has been at least highly controversial. Very often, it's been blatant misrepresentation. Various factors influence discourse building in general. In this case, I'd like to lay emphasis on two of them. First, the context of bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States, and second, the social subjectivity, encompassing aspects such as ideology, beliefs, and others. Well, historically, bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States have been characterized by conflict. In this context, media has been wielded as a weapon. A key question here is, would modifications occur after 17D? Well, before presenting the results of our research, I'd like to go over some ideas, arguments put forth by Jorge Hernandez, present here, in several works. I provided two examples there. It's a set of ideas, a set of beliefs that, from his point of view, and I subscribe to it, are hegemonic in the US society. I'm well aware that there is a wide political spectrum in the US society. However, according to this author, and I subscribe to it, there is a clear set of ideas that is predominant. Well, capitalism is the ultimate system, the only system ever known by that society since it emerged as an independent nation. They pictured themselves as the world leaders of that system. Liberalism, individualism, emphasis on private property, a messianic attitude, manifest destiny, restriction on the role played by the state, market and competition as factors that play a fundamental role in the regulation of social relations. There is a strong belief that the United States is a chosen people. In general, we could argue that in the US society, this idea prevails. This set of ideas prevails. Conservatism that thrives within a liberal matrix. Well, having said this, we're going to present the results of our research. We analyzed 190 articles published by the New York Times on Cuba over the first year after 17D. Well, theoretically and methodologically, we worked with certain tools resulting from our own doctoral dissertation. We don't have time to cover that here. Very briefly, we could say that that methodology was inspired by Van Dyck to a great extent, also Thompson's and his deep hermeneutic staging or advocating or promoting three basic phases to do discourse, critical discourse analysis. First, socio-historical analysis, then a formal analysis of the structure of discourse, and third, a reinterpretation of the data collected based on the first two phases. Well, based on that, we elaborated parameters that were also considered different dimensions from which the analysis was conducted: the semantic dimension, pragmatic dimension, semiotic, logical, ideological, political, cultural, and historical dimension. Of course, we don't have time to talk about the over 30 parameters we used to conduct the analysis. Well, the results. Concerning the topics discussed by the New York Times discourse, in the New York Times discourse in those 190 articles, there is a wide variety of topics ranging from the evolution of negotiations between Cuba and the United States in the new context, to the internal situation of Cuba, different aspects of the Cuban society, economy, sports, and many others. However, in this regard, two topics stand out. One of them is the harm inflicted by the blockade on the Cuban people. My colleagues mentioned that in previous lectures. Well, that is hotly debated by the New York Times. Blockade is presented most of the time, for the most part, as an excuse by the Cuban government to justify its own internal problems. The other topic that is interesting is the so-called dissidents that, as we know, for the most part, are financed by U.S. institutions. So it's a very controversial issue, that name is. And actually, their impact on the Cuban society is very little. However, the topic is blown out of proportion in the discourse of the United States for obvious ideological reasons. Well, in general, we don't have much time to look into details, but in general, we can argue, as a result of the analysis, that the image projected on Cuban domestic reality is incomplete, fragmented, and often inaccurate. Compared with previous periods, because we had the chance to analyze previous periods, well, there is greater bilateralism, meaning that now that there is a new policy, they present Cuba's arguments more often. However, when that ever happens, when it comes to presenting Cuba's views on certain issues, those arguments are presented in an isolated way. They are presented in a fragmented way, also inarticulate, insufficiently elaborated, and often legitimized. There is a tendency to repeat and systematically deploy arguments in tune with the set of ideas we went over before. In previous periods that we had the chance to analyze, there was balance between the ideas promoted by the hardliners, the traditional hardliners toward Cuba, and a different view. Well, now, in the new context, the New York Times proves the historical tendency that has been described by many authors of supporting Democrats. And the new policy is usually advanced with more elaborated, better formulated arguments in better positions in discourse and more often. Although we have to say that also the arguments by the hardliners are also presented. Well, the quid pro quo issue is very interesting because it's recurrent in thank you. Okay, the quid pro quo issue is recurrent also in the discourse analyzed. Very often in that discourse, the idea that Cuba should reciprocate every action taken by the United States appears. We well know here that historically all the policies adopted by the United States, or many policies, have been aggressive and mounted unilaterally. So they have to be dismounted unilaterally without expecting Cuba to do anything in return that is functional to the US interests of regime change in Cuba, for instance. But that demand does appear in the New York Times discourse often. Well, in general, this is very interesting and deep. We don't have time to cover much of it. It's further developed in the paper, in the written paper. The liberal conceptualizations of democracy, human rights, freedom, and civil society are presented as if they were universal. Well, in general, the New York Times is in tune with the set of beliefs determined by Hernandez, and in a concrete way, in a specific way, we can say that these ideas are promoted, advanced in that discourse. Systematically, it argues that Cuba should shift to a multi-party system, and the respect for individual liberties the way they are understood by the phenomenon thought in the United States. Minimum state intervention in the economy, total freedom for the market forces. Well, all those are the ideas, main ideas promoted for the most part recurrently in those articles. Well, we went deeper into certain questions we wanted to lay emphasis on, which developed here in the paper. Just mentioned some ideas briefly. So why and for what purposes does the United States change its Cuba policy now? That is presented extensively throughout the corpus of articles analyzed. The second question is the connection between the Cuban economy and the blockade, and the Cuban economy itself, and the delicate issue of nationalizations. Well, very briefly about the first, there is a long list of reasons provided by the New York Times why the policy changed now. For instance, the quote, embargo unquote, has benefited, quote, the Castro regime. The goal of overthrowing the Cuban government has not been reached that way. Other countries like China are gaining a growing influence in the Latin American region in terms of project financing and commerce. In the past, there were US politicians who were less interested in this issue, and they supported the Cuban American hardliners. Some did it for fear of losing Cuban American votes, but today most US people and also most Cuban Americans favor lifting the so-called embargo, blockade actually, and quite a few other reasons. It's also interesting that many arguments are deployed as to the new methods the US politicians that promote this policy are going to use to promote change and to try to achieve the same goal. Well, for instance, suppressing the open US hostility as a variable which gathers the Cuban people around their government to face a mighty external force. And for instance, attempting to influence the Cubans to get them to change their system into democracy and dignity, quote unquote, by means of an economic, cultural, and technological influx toward the island, as well as a stronger interaction between Cubans and Eurasians, as Franklin says. It's something he has coined, and I like it. Well, they say Americans in the discourse, of course. In this context, the New York Times criticizes the quote-unquote Cuban slow approach to making deals. Now, well, there is a long list. It's all here in the paper. We don't have much time for that. Well, as to the Cuban economy and its links with the blockade, constantly the Cuban economy is described as wobbly, weak, and all the blame for the Cuban economic problems is placed on the Cuban government and its ideology for the most part. The blockade, as I said before, is presented as an excuse, and hardly ever do they explain the real damage on the Cuban people. For instance, it's presented in discourse that, well, in general, both the historical and multi-causal perspective of the Cuban economic problems are absent, while the transition to capitalism, and this is very important, I think, the transition to capitalism in Cuba is presented as an inevitable step to overcome the difficulties. In this new context of binational relations, the U.S. is depicted as a would-be savior, quote unquote, of the Cuban economy. In fact, the importance of the U.S. executive's regulatory changes is blown out of proportion. Concerning nationalizations, I elaborate on this here, it's quite long. Briefly, we could say that the Cuban point is omitted for the most part. The nationalization is presented as a forceful act carried out by Cuba. It's presented as an unfair act that should be corrected in order to normalize relations between both countries. There are many descriptions as to that, however, hardly ever do they show the Cuban reasons. Actually, well, there are many reasons that never appeared in that discourse. For instance, the fact that Cuba compensated to many countries like Spain and Britain, companies from those countries. And well, there was a complex situation concerning Cuba and the United States. In fact, the United States is now want to accept certain conditions for that compensation, conditions that were inevitable to a great extent. So it's really complex. It's real here in the paper. Well, conclusion. I'm going to read the conclusion. It's one page to have a big picture of the paper. Well, the paper is the result of the analysis of a large corpus of articles on Cuba published by the New York Times over a pivotal period in the history of the Cuba-United States relations, in which these two nations reestablished diplomatic relations and agreed on moving along in a process toward normalization of bilateral relations, after half a century of U.S. hostile policies against Cuba. The relevance of the research lies in the peculiarities of New York Times as a leading newspaper in the promotion of a new U.S. policy toward Cuba. The significance of this study also lies in the need to analyze large corpora to reveal opinion and ideological trends in the mainstream media, especially on issues that are controversial and also essential to the nations involved. This idea is taken from Chomsky, for instance. That is why this research can contribute to inter-ideological debates and to explaining power relations and the way they manifest themselves in discourse. It may also be helpful when it comes to searching for the truth about complex topics that have historically engendered political and ideological polarization. Critical discourse analysis was used as an interdisciplinary approach. Specifically, parameters brought forward based on various dimensions were applied as methodological instruments. Resulting from the application of this methodology, including the analysis of the recurrences and trends found in the corpus, relevant opinions and ideological tendencies were detected on various topics related to Cuba in the new context of relations with the United States. The newspaper displays a definite tendency toward the predominant set of beliefs, or credo in Spanish, that characterizes the U.S. society as described by Jorge Hernandez, and extensively promotes the new policy shaped by the White House toward the island as a tactic to induce the political change that could not be forced through its downright hostile hardline policies enacted over half a century. Two more paragraphs. The reasons why the U.S. now changes its policy emerge in the corpus, as well as the paths North American country intends to follow so as to contribute to a change to capitalism in Cuba. With regard to the Cuban economy, the image conveyed in discourse is that of a failed economy resulting from the wrongdoing of the Cuban government and its ideology, while the importance of the impact of the economic, financial, and commercial blockade imposed on the island over half a century is minimized. On the other hand, the impact of the positive U.S. executive's regulatory changes is discursively magnified. The delicate issue of the nationalizations carried out by Cuba in the wake of the revolution is distorted because the Cuban view is not voiced, and the island is blamed for the U.S. owner's failure to be properly compensated. This discourse construction misrepresents objective reality and oversimplifies complex phenomena. Thank you very much.
Okay, we actually have about the 35 minutes that we're supposed to have, and then we'll eat about 12:30. Could the gentleman that, the Cuban gentleman who came up before, is he still? Yeah. Was it you? Yeah. Make the comment. We'll take maybe 3 or 4 comments, depending, because we want to get through them. So here, I'm sorry, what? I'm sorry, what about Paul's paper? Okay, one momentito. How many people want to say something? Let me see how many hands I have. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay.
Okay. No, bueno, muchas gracias por excelente las ponencias. Me quería referir a la ponencia sobre la base de Guantánamo. Por supuesto, la introducción con la venta de comida chatarra en la base fue, me imagino, un elemento de motivación, ¿no? Pero realmente el ponente hizo énfasis con la represión brutal de los presos que se detienen en diferentes partes, fundamentalmente del Medio Oriente y otras partes, y son sometidos a las más técnicas brutalidades para obtener su confesión. Yo creo que de eso se podría profundizar y arrojaría un salto muy terrible. Pero por otra parte, las relaciones la presencia de la base naval en nuestro territorio ha tenido escenas dramáticas para nuestro pueblo. Uno de los guardias fronterizos, Luis Ramírez López, fue asesinado. Las tropas norteamericanas. Por otra parte, sobre cuál sería el destino que Cuba le daría a la base naval, en nuestra política exterior, en los momentos actuales, Cuba enfatiza convertir a América Latina en una zona de paz, y nuestro interés nacional es la paz. Por lo tanto, no me preocupa, yo creo que no le puede preocupar a Estados Unidos esa preocupación. Además, como jurista, sé que tenemos derecho a la soberanía de la base, porque como han afirmado algunos juristas notables, y yo le invitaría que se leyera los trabajos de Álvarez Tabillo, un destacado jurista nuestro que llegó por oposición a ocupar el cargo de miembro del Tribunal Supremo, o como de Miguel de Estéfano y Pisani, ambos fallecidos, que estudió en la Sapienza y que realmente, a pesar de haber tenido un origen muy vinculado a las altas clases dominantes, fue un paladín de nuestro Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores. Usted sabe que cuando un tratado internacional no fija fecha, el máximo es de 100 años, y creo que la base tiene más de 100 años de ocupación por parte de Estados Unidos. Por otra parte, cuando el colega del CCU hablaba de las dificultades del New York Times respecto al sistema de partido no competitivo y monopartidista que tenemos en Cuba, como un mecanismo indudablemente que tal vez, no quiero conjeturar, es objeto mismo del bloqueo y de la presión al cual nos han sometido. Pero bueno, quiero decir que nos llama la atención cómo Estados Unidos mantiene relaciones normales. Hace poco un estudiante vietnamita me hizo un trabajo sobre las relaciones de Estados Unidos y Vietnam, y me sorprendía la ayuda económica que le brinda Estados Unidos a Vietnam, país donde murieron una cantidad enorme de norteamericanos y se generó el síndrome de Vietnam. Estados Unidos mantiene también relaciones similares con China, donde existe un sistema monopartidista y donde el ejército es el actor principal, y ahí ha trasladado una buena parte de su industria. Claro, desde luego, no la industria de punta. Muchas gracias.
Let me see all the hands again. Okay, I'm going to give numbers to people, okay, because otherwise I'm going to get lost. So, 1, 2, 3. Your hand up or not, Taylor? No. 4. 5. I'm going to hold you, Jorge, because I already have you. 6, 7 with Jorge. Is that it? Did I miss somebody?
Did you get me?
8.
8.
Are we still taking questions for Darian?
I'm sorry, the questions, we have 2 papers together. The questions are for both people. They can be directed to either one person or both person, and both people are able to answer them. So we're going to take, I have 8 questions, we're going to take 4, and then we're going to have some responses, and then we're going to take the last 4. So everyone remember your number, because I've already forgot the numbers other than they go up to 8.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to abuse your rules just a bit. I'm going to speak very briefly but comprehensively, I hope. Olga began the conversation today talking about hegemony, and I think all these papers link in that way. We had Darian talk about trauma, but in fact, in the United States, we can talk about trauma without talking about the way in which that concept is hegemonized. We can talk about trauma without actually talking about the way in which the economic system we live in, through its violence, its dispossession, its annihilation of individual and collective autonomy, really creates the larger context for many of the traumas that we embrace and endure. And when we only focus on maybe the level of the individual, we really never get to the point of the systemic level of the trauma that maybe is the key to the resolution of trauma ultimately. We heard discussion about Guantanamo Bay, and it's fascinating to me that as an American, we can hear many critiques about the ways in which detainees who've been housed there have been treated, but never about the legitimacy of the United States actually occupying the base. That is never a topic of discussion. It's completely outside of American consciousness. And I hope Cuban friends understand that. And maybe, as Paul was saying, one of the possible openings that we have is the reestablishment of diplomatic ties may offer opportunities for Americans to become more aware of the fact that we actually occupy a piece of territory that doesn't belong to us. Because most Americans have no clue, because it's never raised in a critical context. My final comment is to address Jorge's observation about the United States. It may be true that the hegemonic discourse of the United States argues that we have minimal involvement of the state in the economy, but I think that has to be disaggregated. We have minimal involvement of the state in the economy when it comes to social uplift, when it comes to subsidies, protections for capital. The intervention is massive. To talk about just one dimension, we talk about the military system, which is connected to private corporations that produce under contract, which is a major way in which we conduct our own research and development. That occupies over half of the discretionary budget. It's a huge outlay. If we want to talk about the oppressive elements of the state, which also have economic dimensions in terms of prison industrial complex, it's also quite massive. But in terms of actually eating humanity and doing socially useful things, it is very minimal, and that I totally agree. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Next we had,
I was 2.
all right, good.
Okay, I want to follow up on that last point that was raised. It's not clear to me to what extent Jorge's study and only he can answer to that, is a study of the ideas, the ideology of the political elite or of the popular classes in the United States. And it seems to me that there is a significant difference between them on many points. And that's important in order to understand what has been driving U.S. policy toward Cuba. I don't think it's so much the popular beliefs of U.S.ians, it's rather the ideas and objectives of the political elite, who still, for example, embrace the basic notion of manifest destiny. Whereas I think that the popular sentiment in the U.S. is much more non-interventionist, much more accepting of political pluralism and national sovereignties. So I'd just like you to reflect a little bit about what has been driving U.S. policy and how that, and what the ideology of the elite is, which presumably the New York Times has reflected with respect to that.
I'll take number three now. Who is number three?
I will say something, but.
Yeah. Number three.
Yep.
Was it you? Three? Come on, guys. Can't have your numbers. Hey, who's number four, for curiosity? Who is number four?
He's number 4.
Okay, three, go with three. Yep.
Again, let's switch mics.
And after this, we'll do answers by both you guys. There'll be 5 questions at this point.
Speak.
Hi, I've been involved in solidarity work in Latin America, and Cuba has always been the big backer, of us and has our back. And a couple of years ago, when Obama went to the OAS, he pulled kind of a bait and switch. He holds out a hand to Cuba and turns around the same conference and starts the same kind of attack against Venezuela that had been so long against Cuba. And I'm wondering how, with a bilateral agreement, when you have to be kind of nice diplomatically now with Obama, how you handle the solidarity with Venezuela, which is right now under very serious attack immediately, and also approaching Bolivia in the same way. So how do you, as good, strong, you've always been our comrades, how do you negotiate this kind of a thing diplomatically?
Great. Now we'll take responses from these two on those 5 questions, and then we're going to take the final 5 questions that we have, starting. Go ahead.
Well, concerning the set of ideas determined or established or described by Professor Jorge Hernandez, present here, I'd like to clear up something. First of all, I made it clear in the first place that the political and ideological spectrum of the United States society is very broad. And now we have evidence about that. There is polarization, we have Sanders, we have Trump, many things in between. And from Marxism, and also by studying Gramsci, we all know that he dominates economically, militarily, and politically in society, also dominates spiritually. So it's hegemony that is spread throughout the society, and that spiritual control has been traditionally enforced in societies by dominant elites. So that's precisely our point here. So we're talking about a set of ideas that has permeated the United States society to its roots, which does not necessarily imply that everyone in the United States subscribes to those ideas. But it is a heavy set of ideas present throughout the society, spread throughout the society, and a dominant set of ideas that to a great extent leads the nation, both internally and in its foreign policy. That's what I wanted to say. Probably Professor Hernandez here would like to add something about it.
With respect to what Jorge was saying about the possibilities of using the base as a place where you could have Coast Guard patrols for drug trafficking, or possibly use it as a weather station for better preparation for hurricanes. That's interesting. I hadn't heard those, and my strong preference would be for the weather station, because I feel like the war on drugs is a fucking disaster. And State Department. Oh yeah. Well, with what Alan said about the fact that most Americans don't even consider the possibility of that a U.S. military base on Cuban soil is offensive in and of itself. I think if you ask the average American how they would feel about a Chinese military base in South Carolina, they have a hard time wrapping their head around it. But this passes as we just have the right to do whatever we want around the world, I guess. But I emailed the State Department and I asked them if they would provide a statement on the possibility of closing the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay, and in a demonstration of how unthinkable that is, their reply to me was entirely about closing the detention camp, not the entire base. With respect to what the gentleman said he mentioned that there was this incident where U.S. soldier on the Guantanamo base shot and killed a Cuban soldier. It's interesting. I didn't do a ton of research, admittedly, for this paper, but I didn't come across that story until I visited the Museum of the Revolution a couple days ago. And you're right, it should have been in my paper, and I apologize. With respect to Cliff's critique of Jorge's outline of American ideology, as an American, I don't think anything was wrong about Jorge's critique, or Jorge's characterization of dominant ideology in America. I think Marx said that the dominant ideology of any nation or people is the ideology of the dominant class within that society. And I don't defer to the great master reflexively, but I agree with that statement.
Well, I'm sorry, I forgot to address something very interesting that a colleague said here. And I'd like to add some comments by quoting Chomsky. Chomsky, in one of the many interviews recently, said, market fundamentalism is a very interesting phenomenon. For one thing, we, this country, meaning the United States, do not believe in markets. So if you look at, for example, the technology inside an iPod, most of it is developed in the state sector in places like MIT. So nothing about markets, computers, internet, technology there. The advanced economy, a lot of it is driven by the state sector, and this goes way back. So the market is for poor people. The rich protect themselves from the market. So the market fundamentalism is preached, but not practiced. It is imposed on others. So you impose it on people. So people should not get food stamps. They should live on the market, but not the rich. They don't get food stamps. They get lavished with massive subsidies of all kinds, no market there. He said that. So I see eye to eye with the colleague who said something about market, the minimum state in the United States. So that's, of course, relative, as Chomsky points out here.
Sí, bueno, un comentario sobre el tema de la base naval. Yo quería decir que en realidad desde su propio surgimiento, es una temática que refleja una aberración desde múltiples enfoques y con una historia plagada de acontecimientos muy, diríamos, tristes para nuestro pueblo. Antes del triunfo revolucionario, la base fue territorio, como lo son muchas de las instalaciones militares de Estados Unidos en otros países, para una serie de lacras con la población de Guantánamo. Ahora mismo, en estos días, hemos estado escuchando un nuevo incidente en Okinawa y lo que ocurre en la mayoría de los lugares donde Estados Unidos tiene instalaciones, que son más de 850 en más de 70 países del mundo. Y después del triunfo, mencionaba el profesor el caso de Luis Ramírez López, está también el de Ramón López Peña, en la década del 60 ambos, pero no solo en la década del 60, la última vez que ocurrieron disparos contra las instalaciones cubanas fue el 7 de diciembre de 1989, cuando el pueblo cubano rendía tributo a los internacionalistas que habían, los caídos en Angola. Se disparó desde la base norteamericana a las instalaciones cubanas. Yo creo que, como decía también el profesor Jorge, este es un tema que tiene una significación en el plano simbólico muy grande para nosotros. Y es un tema de mucha importancia, porque así como nosotros planteamos que para el proceso del restablecimiento de las relaciones diplomáticas debíamos ser excluidos de la lista de países patrocinadores del terrorismo, en la que no debimos estar ni un segundo, y estábamos en 1982, en época del presidente Reagan, hemos planteado que el tema de la base naval de Guantánamo es uno de los 4 grandes puntos para la normalización de esos vínculos. Junto, bueno, las transmisiones radiales y televisivas que deben cesar, el bloqueo y las compensaciones. Al menos 3 de esos 4 puntos tienen una solución unilateral, porque nosotros no hemos hecho absolutamente nada, sin ningún plan con respecto a utilizarla con fines para la agresión a los Estados Unidos, ni nada que se le parezca. Quería recordar también las declaraciones de varios militares norteamericanos, entre ellos el general Sheehan, que hace unos años, ex jefe del Comando Sur, declaró públicamente que la base naval de Guantánamo era totalmente infuncional, desde un ángulo, desde una idea inicial de que Cuba no representaba ningún problema para la seguridad nacional de los Estados Unidos y que esa base era totalmente inoperante. Y bueno, con relación al futuro, nadie podría decir hoy en qué se utilizaría, pero también me vino a la mente cuando intervino el profesor Jorge, que después que terminó en nuestro país la base Lourdes, cuando el presidente Putin decidió que terminara la base Lourdes y la base de Cam Ranh en Vietnam, bueno, Cuba en apenas 106 días convirtió lo que fue una instalación con fines militares, lo convirtió en una de nuestras más potentes universidades, la Universidad de la Ciencia de la Informática. Y bueno, con relación a lo que planteaba la compañera, quería también decir algo. Para nosotros la posición de defensa a Venezuela es una posición irrestricta, incondicional, pero no solo a Venezuela. Los principios de la política exterior cubana se mantienen inalterables independientemente de este proceso de diálogo con los Estados Unidos, y así ha quedado señalado en cada una de las intervenciones públicas de nuestros dirigentes. Cumbre de la CELAC del año anterior en Belén, en San José, Costa Rica, cumbre de Panamá. En todos los escenarios internacionales nuestro país ha ratificado que nuestras posiciones de política exterior son totalmente inconmovibles, y creo que eso es algo muy importante tener en cuenta, porque este proceso no ha sido en base a dejación de nuestros grandes ideales, todo lo contrario. Y el tema de Venezuela para nosotros es un tema, bueno, acaba hace solo unos días estar nuevamente el presidente Maduro en la cumbre de la Asociación de Estados del Caribe, después ahora en el proceso de la firma como país acompañante en el tema de Venezuela, y en todos los casos ha quedado muy claro, no solo en el de Venezuela, sino en el resto de las causas que Cuba enarbola en materia de política exterior, que hay una posición totalmente de defensa incondicional de esa política que está basada en principios y que, bueno, se remonta al propio triunfo de la revolución.
Okay, I think we're 5. Is that the next number? Is there a 5 out there? Okay, well, then we'll go to 6. Doug, and I know Jorge is 7.
It's possible to say?
No, it says 7.
Okay. Here's the microphone.
So first of all, I just want to say that I find panels like this really stimulating when you have the cross-fertilization of various different topics. And so in terms of trauma and media, I just wanted to link those two things together a little bit because Darian had spoken about various forms of trauma in the United States, and one that I constantly refer to for my students is the trauma that comes from the media. Because most television shows in the United States are about crime and violence and basically are meant to make the American people afraid all of the time. And it makes the police as being the savior, and so you turn to the police because you live in such an incredibly scary society, when in fact our society really doesn't have that much crime and violence. There is some, but not nearly as much as depicted on the television, which to me, all that violence basically disempowers people. So it's like the trauma you're talking about, where people just give up. You know, they have no control over the violence around them, and so they just sort of give up and wait for somebody else to take care of them. And then in terms of the media, the New York Times, in their view of Cuba, I don't speak Spanish, which is my failing. So I haven't been able to watch much television down here, but just the images that I've been seeing on the television I find disturbing, because lots of music videos and things that just seem to glorify consumerism, to glorify individualism. Maybe if I heard the words, it wouldn't be so bad, but the images to me are undermining the socialist project, and I find that somewhat disturbing. And so I just wanted to say how much I thought that the panel sort of tied these things together. So I guess all I have in terms of a question is, you've demonstrated very clearly that the New York Times is a waste of time, that you shouldn't even bother reading the New York Times to find out what's going on. So do you have a suggestion for those of us who are horribly monolingual of something that we can find out better what is going on, where I could read it in English? Gracias.
Jorge, number 7, you're great.
Muchas gracias por las papers, por la ponencia, todo muy interesante. El tiempo siempre nos presiona, pero me pareció muy importante la ponencia que tenía que ver con los traumas, y me recordaba mucho las representaciones que en Cuba tenemos a partir de la literatura y del cine estadounidense. La televisión cubana puso no hace mucho una película con Barbra Streisand y Nick Nolte que se llama El Príncipe de las Mareas, que es un drama familiar donde el protagonista fue objeto de una violación y lo ocultó toda la vida, y eso fue un incidente traumático. Y más allá, recordaba en mi niñez, en la década de 1950, una película con Lana Turner, creo que fueron los más viejos, recordamos quién era. El nombre de la película era Peyton Place, el nombre del pueblecito, pero en español la película se titulaba La Caldera del Diablo, porque en español se dice que pueblo chiquito, infierno grande, y había una historia de violación también. Somos muy sensibles por la historia más reciente y el drama de los veteranos de guerra que han regresado, no solo de Vietnam o de Corea en su momento, sino de Irak y de Afganistán, y la manera en que esto también a través del cine. Hay una película con Benicio del Toro, que ha estado en la guerra, es de una comunidad de indios nativos americanos y viene trastornado y no recibe el tratamiento que requiere. La cuestión es hasta qué punto, como política de gobierno, de Estado y aún en la sociedad civil estadounidense, los movimientos sociales, el pueblo organizado, hace suyo de manera general la demanda por todas estas preocupaciones. Creo que es un tema muy interesante que nos llegue a nosotros. El segundo comentario tenía que ver con algo que relaciona el punto de Cliff con las citas que había hecho Karell de un trabajo nuestro, de un trabajo mío. La teoría del realismo político en las relaciones internacionales siempre dice que los Estados Unidos no son un actor racional unificado. Tienen múltiples contradicciones y visiones, aún dentro de la propia clase política, aún dentro de la llamada élite de poder, y desde luego los sectores populares no tienen la misma mentalidad que los grupos ideológicamente dominantes. Como bien decía María Engel, y usted lo recordaba, gracias a la ideología alemana, la ideología que se impone, sin embargo, es la de los sectores dominantes, pero afortunadamente hay diferencias. That's why, por eso es que ustedes están aquí y existe una izquierda pujante. Eso se reproduce hoy, cuando tenemos Occupy Wall Street por una parte y el Tea Party por otra, o las posiciones de Bernie Sanders hoy, las de Donald Trump por otro. Creo que eso es importante. El tercer aspecto tiene que ver con una clarificación. El trabajo que hacía referencia a Karell, escrito sobre esa temática hace muchos años, tiene que ver con la cultura política de los Estados Unidos, más bien en la perspectiva de ideología dominante, definida por una serie de rasgos que tienen vigencia hoy. Y la referencia al destino manifiesto tenía que ver más bien como el acompañamiento a la etapa de la expansión continental de los Estados Unidos. Digo esto porque a partir de 1898 y de la intervención en la guerra en Cuba, de Cuba contra España, y el momento en que se apoderan de Puerto Rico también y de las Filipinas, marca una nueva etapa. Pero ese sentido del mesianismo, de tener que preocuparse por la libertad de los otros, que lleva consigo una capacidad de intervención, hoy se habla de intervención humanitaria, es algo que ha estado ahí. El cuarto comentario es que, sin embargo, en cuanto a la cultura política de los Estados Unidos con respecto a Cuba, que de eso yo no he escrito, sugeriría revisar, sé que a lo mejor esto iba a estar en la presentación, el trabajo de una persona en los Estados Unidos que es hijo de migrantes cubanos. El nombre es Luis J. Pérez Jr., se le conoce como Lou Pérez Jr., es profesor en la Universidad de Chapel Hill en North Carolina y es un historiador importantísimo de las relaciones históricas Cuba-Estados Unidos, sobre todo en el campo de la cultura. Su último libro es algo así como Cuba en la imaginación o en el imaginario norteamericano, y habla de las metáforas con respecto a Cuba. Y es muy importante porque él señala, por ejemplo, no recuerdo el nombre del político, es una frase que se le atribuye a Jefferson, pero es por error. Era un senador o un gobernador que en el año 1806 decía algo como esto: Cuba es el resultado de la sedimentación de las arenas del río Mississippi en el Golfo de México. Imagínense ustedes el derecho de concernimiento, de interés por Cuba, y hay múltiples caricaturas que ilustran desde la prensa estadounidense del siglo XIX y del XX y también del XXI la representación de Cuba como una mulatica que necesita defensa ante los soldados españoles, por las tropas americanas, etc. Entonces esta representación es algo que ha estado impregnando la gran cultura política dominante en los Estados Unidos, pero por desgracia eso llega como parte de la hegemonía, que como decía la doctora Olga Fernández, hay que verla como completándose en el terreno cultural siempre. Esa es parte de alguna visión que tiene alguna gente en Kansas City o en Tennessee o en Memphis, donde vivía Elvis Presley ahí. La gente a veces no sabe ni dónde está Cuba. Sí, ajá. Entonces, hay una gran ignorancia a veces. Cuando la causa de los 5 héroes que ustedes ayudaron a reclamar su liberación, o el secuestro del niño Elian González, ¿no? que la madre muere en un intento de cruce ilegal de la Florida en el año 99, fue una gran bronca entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos, una causa nuestra como la de los 5 héroes. Había lugares en los Estados Unidos que eso ni siquiera se conocía. El compañero Ricardo Alarcón, cuando era presidente de la Asamblea Nacional y tenía la tarea por la Dirección Política Cubana de atender esto, interactuó con ustedes varias veces, lo conocen Al, Cliff y otros compañeros, decía, la batalla por los 5 tiene que ser política y ante todo hay que generar una conciencia y un conocimiento dentro de los Estados Unidos, porque Cuba no es una prioridad en la escala de inquietud de los Estados Unidos. La mentalidad esa que florece en las sagas, en las series televisivas, como los Friends. Es la mentalidad del blanco anglosajón y protestante, los sectores medios. Eso es lo que impregna los cómics de los Simpsons también. Y es una mentalidad a veces que tiene mucho de banalidad. El último punto tiene que ver con un comentario que hacía el profesor Salinas cuando comparaba, refiriéndose a la postura de Cuba con Vietnam y con China y el contraste con Cuba. No sé si Salinas está todavía por aquí. Ajá. Pero yo eso lo matizo y lo veo desde una perspectiva distinta. Cuba y China no son lo mismo, ni Cuba y Vietnam. Vietnam y China están en el lejano oriente. Desde Cuba, usando una frase popular, no es grosera, pero es ordinaria, diríamos, China y Vietnam están en casa el carajo para los Estados Unidos. No sé cómo se dice eso en inglés. Eso es cultura cerrada, cultura asiática, además de la distancia. Cuba es cultura occidental. Y estamos aquí apenas a unas millas. La simbología que tiene el mejoramiento de la relación con Cuba, desde luego que no puede ser la misma con lugares tan distantes que son referentes culturales muy diferentes, con el culto a la personalidad, con Mao Zedong, se pudiera hablar ahí hasta de Corea del Norte también, y todo lo demás. Por tanto, hay un matiz ahí que tiene que ver con otros elementos, porque Cuba, termino con esta idea, posee un simbolismo tremendo. El mejor ejemplo de ese simbolismo, de nuevo, es la base de Guantánamo. Cuba puede negociar cuestiones relacionadas con la ley de ajuste cubano o con la política migratoria. Ahí hay cosas que pueden ser bilaterales. Pero con la base de Guantánamo, Obama habló, en efecto, como usted bien señaló, de cerrar la prisión. Pero eso no es la solución del problema. La solución es cerrar la base naval militar y retirarse de ese territorio. Gracias.
Our last question.
Dr. Acosta, maybe I missed some of this because I haven't been listening to the Spanish translation, but can you give us 2 or 3 examples of some of the significant negative impacts of the U.S. embargo on the Cuban people? And also positive. For example, I read about some of the advances in medicine as a result of the embargo. So some creative things that the Cuban people or Cuban government have had to do in order to survive. And the other part of that question is, what can we do as a delegation who've come here to help the Cuban people, people to people, or even to help our government to have a more humane policy toward Cuba?
Okay, we're going to move to the responses now. I'm going to ask both of them to maybe just pick 1 or 2, not try to cover them all because we're already way past time. It is important for us that people from the audience be able to make long presentations because the people that are here are receiving, there's a lot of knowledge out there, both among the Cubans and among the other North Americans. So it's not a problem that it happened that way, but time does tend to run out. So I believe both of you are going to be there at lunchtime downstairs. And so if you'll just both pick 1 or 2 to answer, and then if you didn't get your question answered, please grab them at lunchtime and make them answer your question.
Can I have 1 minute?
Yeah. Go.
I'll be very brief then. This might be something the Cuban people here would find interesting. It kind of ties in both with Karell's paper and my own. You mentioned we're talking about weather, turning the Guantanamo base possibly into a weather station to track hurricanes. In the U.S. media, whenever there's a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, there's never any mention of Cuba or the hurricane's threat to the Cuban people. They'll have, they'll show a satellite map. The hurricane will clearly be running over Cuba, to put it that, if I can put it that way. But the story is, once it's deteriorated to a tropical storm, will it nick Galveston, Texas or something? So perhaps that gives you some insight into the ideology of American media.
Okay, I'd like to start by the last question. Well, over the last 24 years, Cuba has presented to the United Nations a comprehensive report on all the damage inflicted by the blockade against Cuba. So, the blockade is a comprehensive, intricate, and complex set of regulations, laws, decrees, proclamations against Cuba, dating from the 1960s, and there's even one that is applied from 1917, Trading with the Enemy Act. So the impact is tremendous. It's all the sectors of the Cuban society have been adversely affected by the blockade. One of the closest markets for Cuba is the United States, and Cuba instead has to access other markets that are far away to buy, from agricultural products to medications, for instance. There are medications that are only produced by U.S. transnationals, for example. Cuba has had to turn to faraway companies in Japan or China, for instance. But it's a long, long list. So it's a report with many pages. All the sectors are deeply affected by the blockade. So at lunchtime we could elaborate on that and give you some concrete examples further. But all in all, that's the idea. Okay, concerning the colleague that asked the question about the media in Cuba and violence in the Cuban media, that's actually a debate. There's actually a debate in the Cuban society now. It's a very controversial issue. On the one hand, we have what Professor Jorge explained the first day in his opening lecture about to what extent we share cultural features with the United States society, culturally speaking. So he explained, illustrated that when in the Cuban television, for instance, a Russian or a French movie is presented and shown on Saturday night, for instance, people complain about it. So it's related to the way in which Cubans identify with not perhaps the values sometimes that have permeated those movies, but the way that the dynamic of the movie. So for the sake of entertainment, so perhaps some Cubans prefer the kind of movie. However, there's a heated debate in the Cuban society about the quality of shows that should be presented on television. Sometimes it has been argued that there aren't enough good materials to project, and that's why, well, they have to combine rubbish with good materials, for instance. Not a valid argument from my point of view, but anyway, it's been on the table sometimes. However, on the other hand, in Cuba, there has been great efforts to promote other movies, to present other programs from Europe, from Latin America. And Cubans enjoy, for instance, the Latin American Movie Festival a lot. You have to come here in December and watch the long lines to watch Latin American movies. So, as to what alternative media would I suggest? Because the New York Times is a waste of time, I like that expression. Well, for instance, I would suggest Along the Malecon. It's a blog published in the United States in English. Russia Today, I think, also publishes in English sometimes. Al-Majalim, it's another media outlet that I would recommend. Actually, as far as I know, the overwhelming majority of alternative media that I know of is in Spanish, unfortunately. I think more is needed in English, of course. Some websites make an effort to translate, for instance, Cuba Debate, which is one of my favorite Cuban media outlets. Cuba Debate, they translate some of their articles, but some of them into different languages, by the way, but only some of them, and they publish very valuable information all the time, but unfortunately not always in English. Well, China has their own media I guess they sometimes publish something in English. Okay, so there are alternative media outlets. We have to dig deep, of course, because that's precisely one of the functions of the mainstream media, to impose themselves in the market. Today, the overwhelming majority of all the information that is produced in the world is in the hands of a very small number of media. So we're talking about 70% in the hands of 5, 6 major media corporations. And that's precisely their intention, to use that overwhelming power to impose their views. So we have to dig deeper to find alternative media. That's all.
Excuse me, shortwave radio, folks. It still exists, it's easy, and it's cheap. And you can get broadcasts from around the world in other languages and in English.
I'll just mention real quickly on sources. There's 2 places you can get an ongoing stream of information. One is by Karen Lee Wall, who's lived down here for about 50 years. And what she does is she finds articles that are published all over the place in English and sends them out on the net, so you can have a constant stream. One of the problems with that is that she also, half of what she writes is about America, about the United States. I don't know if that's a problem or not, but you'll get a lot of emails from her. And the other one is by Jill Hamburg, who also does the same sort of thing. Notices articles on Cuba that different people have put out and reproduces them and sends them out. You can get on their mailing list, you can contact me, and I can put you in touch with them.
Just very briefly on the idea of people being traumatized by the fictional programming on the media. I personally, while some of those shows are very traumatizing for the imagery they present, to me, the deeper issue is the normalization of violence that they propagate. And what I find more traumatizing in the media is the news coverage, because at least with fictional programs, people can say, well, that's fiction, but the news coverage focuses on the same bloody material of crime and fires and car accidents. Also, the point about the hegemonic control of thinking around trauma, I think that's a very significant point. Of course, in the United States, we ignore the effects of our economy in anything. I am thinking of, for example, the traumatic effects of the housing loan crisis and the devastation that it wreaked on whole communities. A subcategory of that is that even among the public in the United States, there's very little awareness or discussion of trauma. We're getting a little of that with PTSD discussions, but it's still mostly limited to specialists. And this whole idea of specialization in the United States, that only mental health workers or social workers or such should be the ones concerned about trauma, rather than acknowledging that as a broad social phenomenon that deserves discussion. I see that again as part of the hegemony of thought.
Okay, I want to, let's give a big hand for all 4 of our presenters. The bus will leave at 2:30, is that correct, Cliff? No. Okay, not correct. Okay.
Yeah, just a quick announcement.